On September 11, 2025, Yu Menglong's name stopped belonging only to costume dramas, polished red carpets, and the carefully lit world of celebrity. It became the center of a national shock. Reports spread across Chinese social media that morning saying the actor had fallen to his death in a residential community in Beijing. Later that same day, his studio confirmed that he had died, and authorities said criminal involvement had been ruled out. The official explanation was devastatingly plain. Police said he had fallen to his death after drinking. But there are some endings the public refuses to accept in their first form, and Yu Menglong's death became one of them almost immediately. He was 37, still young enough to look unfinished in the eyes of fans, still visually tied to beauty, restraint, and the fantasy of control that celebrities are expected to wear like armor. That is why the first wave of grief did not arrive alone. It arrived with disbelief. The death itself was already enough to wound people, but what made it darker was the speed at which certainty began to break apart online. Even before the mourning had settled, questions had already started multiplying. Was the official story complete? Why did it feel so abrupt? Why did so many people instinctively believe something else had happened? Reuters later reported that authorities described the death as an accident, while also saying false information and edited fake videos had spread widely enough for police to take measures against people accused of fueling rumors. In other words, Yu Menglong did not simply die in public. He died. And within hours, his death became a battlefield between official explanation, emotional disbelief, and a digital crowd that no longer knew what to trust. What followed was not ordinary mourning. It was a spiral. The more people repeated the official version, the more others treated that version as suspicious. The more social media filled with grief, the more it filled with theories. Some posts claimed there had been hidden truths behind his death. Others pushed the idea that evidence was being buried. Then the internet moved one step further into something even uglier. Fabricated clips, manipulated narratives, and even AI-generated footage were circulated as if they were proof that public outrage had exploded into something larger and more dangerous. AFP later debunked viral posts that falsely claimed there had been a rare anti-government protest demanding justice for Yu Menglong, showing that the clip being shared as evidence was AI-generated and that there was no proof such a rally had taken place. That detail matters because it reveals the real horror at the center of this story. Yu Menglong's death did not remain a tragedy for long. It became raw material for suspicion, performance, rage, and digital manipulation. By the time many people were trying to grieve him, his name was already being pulled apart by rumor merchants, edited videos, conspiracy-minded fan culture, and a public so primed to distrust official narratives that even death itself no longer arrived cleanly. And maybe that is the coldest way to begin this story. Not just with a man falling to his death, but with the instant transformation of that death into noise so loud that even grief could barely breathe inside it. Long before Yu Menglong became a name people argued over, defended, mourned, or turned into conspiracy, he was simply a boy from Urumqi trying to move toward a life bigger than the one he had been born into. He was born on June 15, 1988, in Xinjiang, later studied in Beijing, and entered the entertainment world through the slow, uncertain route that many future celebrities know too well. Not instant stardom, but repeated attempts to be noticed. He appeared in talent competitions years before real fame arrived, first in My Show, My Style in 2007, and then in Superboy in 2010, where he still did not become the breakout star people would later assume he had always been meant to be. That matters, because it changes the feeling of his story. Yu Menglong was not built overnight by one role or one viral moment. Before the polished costumes, the carefully styled interviews, and the image of a man who seemed too composed to fall apart this way, there was a long stretch of trying, waiting, and almost making it. Chinese profiles published after his death describe that path clearly. Urumqi, Beijing performing arts training, early contest appearances, and years of pushing himself forward without yet crossing fully into the kind of fame that changes your life. That kind of beginning leaves a mark on people. It teaches them how unstable visibility can be. It teaches them that being admired later often comes after many years of being ignored first. What makes this part of Yu Menglong's story worth slowing down for is that the man the public later saw as elegant and finished was shaped inside uncertainty. Before he became visually associated with refined beauty and historical drama, he was still moving through the less glamorous parts of becoming someone in entertainment. Competitions, missed chances, training, and the humiliating patience of waiting for your face to finally matter to strangers. By 2011, he had begun acting, and by 2013, he returned to Superboy again, this time reaching the Beijing Championship and the national top 10, which finally pushed him into a more visible career path. But even that did not instantly turn him into the kind of star whose death would later shake the internet into chaos. It only opened the door. The years before true recognition were years of construction, not just of a career, but of an image. The public would eventually meet a man who looked impossibly calm, controlled, and almost unreal in his beauty. What it would never really see was the quieter version that came before. The young man still trying to force himself through the narrow opening of fame, still years away from becoming a screen image people would one day insist they understood. And maybe that is where the sadness of his story actually begins. Not in the rumors after his death, but in the long, invisible stretch before fame, when he was still only a person trying to become visible enough for the world to remember. When Yu Menglong finally crossed from effort into recognition, it was not only because he had stayed in the industry long enough to be rewarded, it was because the image he offered the public was unusually easy to mythologize. He was handsome in a way that felt almost too composed, too refined, too careful to belong to ordinary life. On screen, especially in costume dramas and romantic historical roles, he seemed made for stillness, for elegance, for emotional restraint that hid more than it revealed. That quality is part of why his fame settled into a very particular shape. He was not sold to audiences as loud, reckless, or chaotic. He was sold as beautiful, distant, controlled, and quietly intense. The kind of male star whose appeal depends as much on what he withholds as on what he shows. That made him ideal for roles that required poise, melancholy, and a face audiences could project longing onto. By the mid-2010s, his presence in dramas such as Go, Goal, Fighting, and especially 3 Lives, 3 Worlds, 10 Miles of Peach Blossoms helped turn him into a recognizable figure across a much wider audience. He was no longer just a former contestant from talent shows. He was becoming the kind of actor whose image could live in edits, fan pages, costumes, and idealized scenes long after an episode ended. That transition matters because it explains why his death later became so combustible online. The public was not reacting only to the death of a working actor. It was reacting to the collapse of a visual fantasy it had been building around him for years. But the more the public loved that fantasy, the easier it became to mistake the image for the person. That is often where celebrity stories begin to turn dangerous. Yu Menglong's popularity depended partly on the feeling that he was controlled, almost untouchable, the kind of star whose beauty suggests order rather than chaos. Fans knew the characters, the styling, the photo shoots, the polished interviews, the historical robes, the clean lighting, the calm face. That is what the audience consumed again and again until it began to feel like truth. Yet image is never truth. It is arrangement. It is editing. It is what survives public life after everything inconvenient has been trimmed away. For Yu Menglong, that gap between image and reality may be the key to understanding why the internet could not absorb his death quietly. A man who looked this composed, this curated, this aesthetically safe, did not fit the official explanation in the minds of many fans, even when authorities gave one. The image itself rebelled. People had spent years teaching themselves to believe he was too controlled to end in disorder, too graceful to die in something as ordinary and ugly as a fall after drinking. That is why this chapter matters so much. Before the rumors in Part 1, before the flood of manipulated clips and suspicion, Yu Menglong had already been transformed into a beautiful surface the public believed it understood. And once a celebrity becomes that kind of surface, death does not only end a life, it tears open the illusion that the surface was ever enough to explain the person beneath it. What made Yu Menglong's story darker was not only the death itself, but what happened to it afterward. In many celebrity tragedies, grief arrives first, and questions come later. Here, grief and suspicion arrived together. The official explanation was given quickly. His studio confirmed his death, police ruled out criminal involvement, and authorities said he had died in an accidental fall after drinking. But instead of closing the story, that explanation seemed to tear it open. For a public already trained by distance, censorship, and mistrust to doubt what appears too neat, the statement did not bring peace. It produced the opposite. Fans did not simply cry. They began searching. Every detail became a trigger. The timing felt abrupt. The wording felt too controlled. The speed of the conclusion felt cold. And because Yu Menglong had spent years existing as a polished, beautiful, highly curated public image, many people found it emotionally impossible to connect that image to an ending so ordinary, ugly, and abrupt. That is the point where celebrity turns dangerous. When the person dies, but the image refuses to let the death make sense. Reuters reported that police said he died after drinking and ruled out criminal suspicion. Yet the same report also made clear that false information spread so widely afterward that authorities moved against people accused of fabricating or amplifying rumors. In other words, the official story did not stop the noise. It became the fuel for even more of it. And once that happened, Yu Menglong was no longer only a dead actor. He became a blank screen onto which thousands of strangers projected fear, anger, fantasy, and mistrust. Then the internet did what it does at its worst. It turned uncertainty into content. Posts began circulating with hidden plot theories, emotional accusations, and the suggestion that the public was being lied to. The rumors did not stay verbal. They became visual. Edited clips, cut-together footage, and eventually AI-generated materials started moving through social media as if they were proof of some deeper truth. That shift is what makes this chapter so poisonous. Once manipulated images enter a grieving public sphere, the dead person stops belonging to memory and starts belonging to narrative warfare. AFP later debunked one of the most viral claims, showing that the video being shared as evidence of a rare anti-government protest demanding justice for Yu Menglong was AI-generated, and that there was no evidence such a rally had happened. But by then, the emotional damage had already been done. The existence of the fake clip mattered less to many people than the feeling it gave them. It fed the idea that something had been covered up, that the public was being denied the real story, that grief itself required suspicion in order to feel complete. And maybe that is the cruelest part of all. Yu Menglong did not get the dignity of a clean mourning. His death was immediately swallowed by rumor culture, distrust, and a digital ecosystem that rewards intensity over truth. The actor who had once been sold through order, elegance, and visual control was now trapped inside the exact opposite. Chaos, distortion, and a flood of narratives nobody could fully stop once they began. By this point, the story was no longer only about how he died. It was about how quickly the internet can transform death into spectacle, and how easily a public already hungry for hidden meanings can mistake manipulation for proof. That is why this chapter matters so much. It is the moment when the tragedy stops being personal and becomes collective, when one man's death turns into a mirror reflecting paranoia, fandom, censorship, and the unbearable modern truth that even grief is no longer allowed to stay human for very long. After Yu Menglong died, what remained was not only grief, but a strange and bitter kind of afterlife built from noise. In many celebrity deaths, time eventually creates a cleaner emotional space. The first shock fades, the rumors thin out, and the person is slowly returned to memory through images, performances, and whatever beauty they left behind. Yu Menglong was not given that kind of ending. Even after the official explanation had been repeated, the atmosphere around his name stayed unstable. Fans mourned him, yes, but mourning was constantly interrupted by suspicion, reposted theories, distorted clips, and a public conversation that seemed unable to choose between sorrow and doubt. Reuters later reported that Chinese authorities used the case as part of a broader crackdown on online content described as inciting hostility, pessimism, or spreading fabricated narratives, which shows just how far beyond ordinary celebrity grief this story had already gone. His death had become entangled with something larger than his life: mistrust, platform manipulation, information control, and a digital culture that no longer knows how to let tragedy remain only tragic. That is what makes his story feel so cold in the end. Yu Menglong did not disappear into silence. He disappeared into argument. And once that happens, a person's image begins to split in two: the real human being who died, and the endless online construction built from fear, desire, disbelief, and rumor. That split may be the final sadness of his story. For years, the public had consumed Yu Menglong as a controlled image, beautiful, elegant, emotionally restrained, and visually distant enough to invite fantasy. After his death, that same image was pulled into a harsher function. It became evidence for whatever people already wanted to believe. To some, he was a victim of something hidden. To others, he became an example of how quickly internet culture can exploit death. AFP's fact-checking later showed that some of the most emotionally powerful material circulating after his death, including a supposed protest clip tied to demands for justice, was false or AI-generated. But by that point, the emotional truth of the internet had already beaten factual truth to the center of the story. People had already felt the fear, the anger, the suspicion, and those feelings often outlive corrections. That is why Yu Menglong's case lingers in such an uncomfortable way. It forces you to see how little room there is now for a public death to remain human. Even beauty cannot protect a person from becoming content once they are gone. In the end, Yu Menglong did not leave behind only dramas, photo shoots, red carpets, and fan edits. He left behind a warning. A man can die. And before grief has time to become grief, the world can turn him into a theory, a battle, a symbol, or a piece of manipulated footage. Maybe that is the bleakest closing image of all. Not just a star who died young, but a death that was swallowed so quickly by rumor and digital spectacle that even mourning itself seemed to lose its shape.